Welcome to this brief introduction on working effectively in teams. My name's Paul Levy, and I'm very happy to be introducing some of the core ideas around that idea. How do we work effectively together? How do we collaborate in a group? And collaborating effectively in a group is a key question for a lot of organizations. And that question, that challenge, is a challenge today as much as it was 30, 40, or 50 years ago. Now, a collaborative group is often called a team. That was a term that came into business probably actually even 40 or 50 years ago, but was a bit of jargon that was around the 70s, the 80s, and the 90s. And team working has been a term that sometimes, if you look at the images you can find online, the photography, the pictures of teams, is usually showing sports teams. It's showing people together helping each other up a mountain or in a boat together going down a river. Team working is seen in a kind of romantic way as people achieving high things, high performance teams meet goals, meet objectives because they're better together than they are separately. And in history, you can find that word used, for example, in agriculture, where there were teams of oxen, teams of animals. And again, there was the notion that we can achieve more if we coordinate a group together. Now, team, of course, came out of that sports metaphor, and the notion of a football team winning in a game is because that team works more effectively together. Now, the debate and the discussion around team working has often got one viewpoint, which is those teams work together because there is a leader of that team, a team leader, and that teams work effectively together only when there is leadership. An alternative view of that is actually team working needs less leadership, and that people work, you might say, on the horizontal rather than on the vertical, where the vertical is a traditional form of organization with a hierarchy, and somebody higher up will delegate, will empower a team, and that team will usually have a team leader. But more recently, you'll find in organizations the notion of horizontal teams and concepts like self-managed teams, self-managed or self-organized teams is a challenge to the traditional need for hierarchy. Team effectiveness, still, whether it is a vertical led team or it's a more horizontal self-managed team, is still around some key skills that haven't really changed in a long time. They are about words like trust, that teams tend to perform effectively when there are high degrees of trust in that team. Teams also tend to work effectively when the team itself has skills to listen, skills to manage time, skills to prioritize. And then whether we are online as a team or we meet face to face in a room, some tools and techniques are often skills that can be learned, sometimes on training courses, sometimes through practice, that you can have a highly skilled team in terms of its ability to communicate, its ability to coordinate its work. Another, perhaps less known word, or certainly less used word in team working, is innovation. Linked to that is creativity. Even less known is originality, original thinking, thinking outside of the box, where the box is the way we currently do things, and thinking outside of it is a team that questions the way things are done. So another measure of an effective team is its ability not only to achieve existing goals and existing tasks, but when it is allowed to, it can also challenge what we currently do, think differently, think innovatively, and actually change the status quo and push things forward in ways that we didn't imagine when we started out. So an effective team is able to coordinate its work, communicate its work, whether it has leadership or is self-managed, but it's also able to think creatively, to think innovatively. Now, one of the ways that that comes about also challenges processes of teams, literally in terms of how we work on a day-to-day basis. In traditional organizations, team meetings happened around a boardroom table and was very much like a version of the higher senior management board meeting. But more recently, and certainly even 20 years ago, teams tended to meet sometimes informally. And I was in a company recently where most team meetings take place in the organization's coffee area and not in meeting rooms at all. This is a cafe culture. This is now a culture where working more informally can sometimes be shown to achieve more. And if you hear words like agile, agile team working, agile management, quite often those teams are much more around the table, a round table, literally, rather than a square table with a boss at one end. So some of the research now about collaborative working in teams is also about the environment in which we work, and that trust is not just formally won in organisations through procedures, but is also there through the rapport, the interaction, literally around the coffee table as well, and the ability to trust each other. Now that is now where team working is really being explored, that the informal culture of the organisation is being seen as important as the formal levels of permission and resources. Now that becomes a challenge also where, say, two organisations join up and merge, or where one takes over another, because one could be a hierarchical culture, the other one could be much more of a horizontal culture, and those things could create conflict. So often in effective team working, we also need to look at the culture, to share our assumptions, to get to know each other, and sometimes to have creative conflict around that too. And that's often to be found anyway in some models of how groups develop. You've probably heard the one where the group forms and then it storms before it norms and performs. And that storming isn't something to be avoided. It's something that we have to take on. That disagreement and dialogue around disagreement is as much part of effective team working as just being nice to each other. So that's really around teams. Teams can perform effectively, but the actual way we work together as teams is changing. That's also coming from the different assumptions of what's called the millennial generation, younger people who want more permission given at work, more empowerment, and don't just want to be micromanaged by their bosses. A lot of change, and it's really interesting to start to read about team working, look at how the toolkit is changing, and to ask yourself, what kind of a team member am I?